Hello, this is an episode of the I4I Conversations. I am Rukmini Banerji with Pratham, and with me, let me pass you on to my colleague. Wilima, over to you.
And I'm Wilima Wadhwa with the ASER Center, Pratham Education Foundation. Very nice to be here. And like Rukmini, you and I were just talking just now, it's kind of feeling really nostalgic and missing Ashok, because the last time we were on an I4I forum, it was Ashok interviewing the two of us. Remember?
So really, yes, I feel Ashok is with us, because if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be in this conversation. Yeah. So I don't know if you dedicate sessions to Ashok, but we would dedicate not just this session, but all your sessions, I think, to Ashok. Yes. So I thought what we can do is, let me kick off the conversation. Wilima and I have worked together for many years. And so in a way, we are sort of two sides to the same coin, if you may. Wilima, you want to start with the sort of describing during COVID how we adapted in ASER to the conditions and sort of what was the sequence of events that happened. And then at some point you can stop and lob a question over the fence to me, and then I can take it from there and back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as many of you may know, we were doing ASER every year from 2005 to 14. And then we started, after a break in 2015, we started a new series in 2016, where we were doing the big foundational ASER across all 600 rural districts of the country every other year. So we did it in 16 and 18. And then, so 2020 was the year that we were going to go across the country to do ASER. And then, of course, you know that in March 2020, the world shut down. And so, initially we thought, oh, maybe things would open and maybe we'd be able to do it. But it was clear very soon that there was no way that we were going to be able to go into the field. But at the same time, it was very clear that we needed an ASER, an annual status of education report for 2020, because schools were shut. As in the rest of the world, even here, governments pivoted really fast, tried to share all kinds of learning materials online. And it was very important to know what was going on. There was a fair amount of information, Rukmini, on the kind of stuff that state governments were sharing, but we had absolutely no idea what was going on inside the homes. Did children have access to these materials? Were there any learning activities going on? What was happening at home with parents and siblings and relatives? What was happening in the community? So we needed to pivot really fast. And so, wanted to do a national survey. To do a national survey, which had to be done on the phone, that was very clear. We'd never done a phone survey before. You needed a frame, and there is no nationally representative frame of phone numbers. And that's where we got kind of lucky, because, as part of ASER, we collect phone numbers of about 350,000 households for monitoring purposes. And so we had those numbers from 2018, which was a nationally representative frame. And so we decided to, learn as much as we can about these things, about the phone survey, and use that as a frame. So we did manage to do a phone survey in 2020, which was done in September, about 6 months after schools were shut. And then again followed it up a year later in September of 2021 with a phone survey. Now, basically, these surveys were focused on looking at children's access to learning materials during the period that schools were closed, and their enrollment status, because as you know, ASER is a foundational tool. We didn't want to test young children on the phone. So the phone surveys were not looking at learning assessments. Instead, they were looking at access to learning materials and what they were doing at home. And to just kind of quickly take you through these findings, there are three major findings in terms of what we found. One was enrollment. What was going on with enrollment? Now, apart from this whole question of how it would affect learning levels, these school closures, there was also a fear, especially in developing countries, that older children would drop out because budgets are squeezed, and especially for girls. And indeed, what we found was that in 2020, the proportion of not currently enrolled children went up from about 2.5% to about 4.6%, 4.5%. But when we kind of dug a little bit deeper into looking at, age groups who are not currently out of school, these were mostly young children. And so, it could be that they were waiting for enrollment. Schools shut down in March. The school year starts in April. So it could be that, so these not currently enrolled children were mostly in the younger age groups. The other thing that we saw, and in 2021, this number remained stable. So we saw an increase of about 2 percentage points, but then it remained stable. In 2021, what we saw in terms of enrollment was an increase in private schools. So, the proportion of children in private schools has been kind of steadily rising in rural India from about 16% in 2006 till it reached about 30% in 2014 and kind of stabilized there, 32%. Then in the first year, we didn't see any decrease in private school, but in 2021, there was a fall of about 3 percentage points in the proportion of children enrolled in private schools and a corresponding kind of increase in government school enrollment. Actually, a little bit more. So from about 65% enrolled in government schools, it went up to 70%. But again, having said that, one needs to qualify that because we know that during this pandemic, lots of smaller, affordable private schools shut down. So it's possible that children, had to shift because their school shut down. We know that migrants went home during this period. So it's possible and it's likely that the children of these migrants were more likely to be in government schools. Also, another thing was that government schools were even though they were closed, they were very successful in distributing rations, the midday meal rations. So that could be another reason why people shifted their children to government schools. And of course, budgets being squeezed, right? So you have to pay a tuition in private schools. So I would say that, it's still too early to say. We need another data point to see where this number has kind of settled now. And in terms of access to learning materials, the big finding actually, and it was really commendable that pretty much most children had access to the textbook of their current grade, and even more so in government schools. And so they had the textbook, and this was the case in 2020, where about 85% children in government schools said that they had the textbook of their current grade, and this number was even higher in 2021. Where the system was lagging was that other than textbooks, only about a third of the children said that they had received some other kind of learning material, and those who had received learning material, most of it was on WhatsApp. And so that was the other thing that we saw during the pandemic, was this huge increase in smartphone coverage. So where it was about 35% in 2018, it was almost up to 70% in 2021. Right. But the thing is that, even though there is a smartphone in the house, it doesn't necessarily mean that the child has access to it. In fact, in 2021, about a fourth of the children said that, yes, there was a smartphone, but they didn't have access. So that these are, in some sense, the major findings of the phone survey. But like I said, Rukmini, we did not test children on the phone. So, is it enough to have a textbook? to learn? Is it enough to get, for some children to get some things on the smartphone, and especially younger kids, who are just learning to read? Can you learn to read on a smartphone? So I'm going to, throw this at you in terms of what we found in terms of learning outcomes during the pandemic.
But before going to the learning outcomes, I have to say that, since 2005 till 2018, every ASER has focused on learning outcomes. The main usual large nationwide ASERs have focused on, is a child in school? Is she able to read some basic text? Can she do arithmetic? And we've always known that the processes behind this are important, because this, what you see in terms of learning level, is an outcome. And it is influenced by many factors in school, in the home. And I do think, looking back, and there is a tendency to sort of retrospectively make things look more rosy than they were. So I don't want to do that. It was a very tough time during the lockdown and after. But because we could not meet families or children one-on-one, because we had to learn how to do things on the phone, I think it forced us to kind of narrow down on what is askable on the phone in terms of what is going on in the household. And, in addition to what Wilima just said, I would say that the picture of the household that came through both these phone surveys was one that was actually quite, I would say, promising. I mean, what it showed is that and these are, bulk of children in rural India did not have any access to Zoom or online classes or any of that. That was clearly an urban phenomena and an urban elite phenomena, probably. But what it showed was that the adults around the children. So how did the textbooks reach the families? There were teachers in government schools. There were officials in the government school system who made that possible. We had questions which said, did you have any interaction with your teacher, whether on the phone or in person? Did you go to the school? Did the teacher come to your house? I don't remember the exact number, but it was, substantial, that there was a lot of reaching out that was happening between the school and the home. And within the home, even if you looked at parents by their educational level, so say if you had both parents who were, had finished primary education or below, or if you look at parents who had high education across and I think education is also a proxy for income. If you looked across this whole range, you would see that there were efforts made within families, even in uneducated families, to spend some time with children to help them. Yeah. Siblings often are not, ever since the Heckman reports of the 1960s of the influence of the home and the school on children's achievement levels. It's always parents, it's always family, but very clearly in our data, siblings seem to play a big role. And as kids were, as the higher class kids had more help from siblings than from parents, which I completely understand. For example, I cannot teach anything more than basics anymore. You come to me with a 9th standard math problem, we'll have to send it to Wilima. So I think that what was happening in the family, what was happening in the community, what were teachers doing, a quantitative view of that showed that, yes, the schools were closed, but there were a lot of human beings doing lots of other things in trying to keep children engaged. And I think that is an important pointer for, whatever this, after the COVID or after the schools have opened phase, that if we got support from families at a very difficult time in the life of the family, in the life of the community, why should that help not be sustained and built on when things are a little bit easier? So I think that the family involvement was certainly a big part of what we saw. And while a lot has been made of these online classes and Zoom and whatnot, I would say the fact that even in poorer households, cell phone ownership has increased, which was obvious because that was the only way to connect. But that children, while a third of the children didn't have access, 2/3 of the children did, or more than that did. So this, the rising of the level of digital connectivity, basic capability, across the country, I think is another rise in the level of the ocean that should not be discounted. Today we are probably readier to use phones for different things. Yes, there will be inequalities in access, as there are inequalities in many other things. We recognize those. But I think if we had done a digital readiness of using phones to do education, health, whatever it may be, in 2020 February, and if we do it in 2023 February, I think there'll be a huge difference. So I mean, these are just adding to what Wilima said. And at some level, I think even for ASER, we've been asked many times, what is the process that leads to that outcome? We have usually not answered it. But I think the 2020 and the 2021 ASERs did force us to think not only about how to get at these inside household dynamics to the extent it's possible to do from far away, and to the extent that these are, actually measurable. And I'm not saying we are going to put that in the big ASERs that we are doing now, but I think the COVID forced us to try new things, which we wouldn't have tried otherwise.
But just to kind of reiterate what we saw, really what you described is this distance between the home, the school, and the community seem to become, smaller, right? Everybody, yes, it was a really hard time, but kind of everybody kind of stepped up to the plate, if you will, to help, right? So that is something that, moving forward, we should not just let it go and go back to business as usual. Yeah.
So, 2020, there was no question of measuring learning outcomes. I think we were still coming to grips. I mean, nobody had any clue how long schools will be closed. At some level, when we did ASER 2020, and we did it in September, which is the usual time in which we do it, it was really only 2 or 3 months into what would have been the new school year. So, we are used to having long vacations. We are used to children coming back. We are used to attendance kind of stabilizing by September. So I would say that 2021 was, everybody did what they could based on what they knew. By 2021, I think there was a real concern that this thing is going on for very long. It was not clear when schools would ever open. And so, there was, we too were very concerned that we need to look at, everybody's talking about learning loss and about, opportunity not to learn and so on. But how serious and how deep is it? Given that even pre-COVID, things were, not good. Our learning levels, if you just track ASER data over time, have been stagnant. If anything, in the early part of the 2010 to 2020 decade, they dipped a bit, but they were slightly slowly coming up. And so we know that these basic ability of children to read and to do math had not changed significantly in the last 15 years. There were all kinds of worries, and we all know that, in the press, in common conversation, that these were things that, we were concerned about. And so sometime in February or March, it was clear that you couldn't do the whole country because there were still parts of the country that were, affected. We made a big push to see in how many states could you actually think about doing a field survey. And there was all kinds of safety issues. ASER is done by, in each district by volunteers from universities, colleges, NGOs. So what kind of risk would be undertaken if people were leaving their own home and going into the village? Would they be allowed to, there are all kinds of sort of safety concerns that we usually, don't have. But, and while arrangements were, and also, we were concerned that we've always done ASER at a particular time of the year, doing it off calendar. What does that mean? How can it be done? And what happened eventually was that we were moving forward, thinking that at least a few major states, if we could do ASER at the same time, we'd at least have a glimpse of the country at a particular point in time. But by the time we got ready and moving, it was really only Karnataka, which we could complete in March 2020, because pretty soon after that, the second wave came. And we got out of and completed the Karnataka, the state level survey by the, I would say literally by the, yeah. And, Wilima, you remember the data entry was delayed because the
forms were sitting with the volunteers.
They couldn't move because, second wave arrived and, so on and so forth. But you cut a long story short, we kept, we all, somehow coped with the second wave. But the conversations that had started earlier in the year, I think that, when it was okay to talk again about things other than COVID, which probably we started doing by August or September, we had been talking to Chhattisgarh government prior to, around the same time that there were the conversations in Karnataka. And so Chhattisgarh government actually very proactively not only wanted to do an ASER, they wanted to do ASER in a way that they could have solid district level estimates so that they could plan. So the Chhattisgarh ASER was, I would say, an officially commissioned ASER saying we want to know where our state is. And West Bengal, so Chhattisgarh ASER for the state was done in, I think, November 2021. September, October 2021. And a similar conversation happened with West Bengal government, where we were able to get in a state level ASER in December of 2021. So 3 ASERs, state level ASERs done in 2021, 1 between the first wave and the second wave, 2 after the second wave, and the last one, the West Bengal one, done, practically in 2022. And I think this was also something that we, we learned a lot from. To me, and I mean, actually, it's strangely, Wilima and I have not sat down and talked a great deal about this. So it's interesting to be, the further away I go from 2005, the more amazed I am how these trends over time help you to think. And so what I want to do, Wilima, is just go back to you. If you want to describe the learning, what did we learn about learning levels from these 3?
So we ended up doing actually 4 ASERs in 2021. We did the Big Phone survey, and then we did 3 state surveys, starting in February, March, and ending in December. So the nice thing about ASER is that there is a trend. So, it's very difficult to talk about learning loss unless you have many data points, because you need to know how learning levels have been changing to even talk about that, this year was different, right? What we found actually in these 3 states was actually absolutely common across all 3. I mean, they were at different levels, right? In both reading and math, the 3 states are at different levels. And, the ranking is also different in reading and math. All 3 states, if we start comparing from, say, about 2014, in reading levels as well as math levels, and I'm talking about primary grades, standard 3, standard 5, had either improved a little bit or remained stable. So they were not falling, okay? And this was true both reading, math, all 3 states. What we saw in 2020-21, when we did these 3 surveys, was that in all 3 states, learning levels dropped. In grade 3, in grade 5, in both reading and math. And not only did they drop, so we're not talking about a little bit of the drop, they came to a level which was below the 2014 level. So it was actually amazing that this happened for both reading and math and across grades and in all 3 states. So to me, that seems to be that, it's a fairly robust finding. But this was, what we saw in 2008. And ASER, as you know, does not track children. We don't go back to the same children. It's a repeated cross-section. But because we've been doing it since 2005, every year till 2014, and then every other year after that, there is a trend, right? So for each state, you can look at what has been happening to learning levels over a fairly long period of time. So even though you're not tracking children, you can certainly track what we call artificial cohorts. And I think I'm going to put this to you, Rukmini, to talk about, what we learn from the trends.
So, we've, obviously we have all heard a lot of concern about learning loss and about the fact that, both children forgot what they knew and children didn't have the opportunity to learn new things. But what I think didn't get talked about perhaps enough was the fact that the learning levels were quite low pre-COVID as well. And in a way, this heightened consciousness about learning, I think as we look ahead, again, this is unanticipated consequence of COVID, that the learning crisis, which should have taken up our attention for the last 10 years, maybe didn't get it that way. But the fact that, because we were aware that schools were closed, I'm sure the new education policy, which also came out in July 2020, was aware of the learning crisis from before. But I think it all happened at the same time. So just going back and adding to what Wilima said, if you looked at these artificial cohorts over time, to us, it was important that before we got all caught up in what loss had happened between 18 and 20 or 18 and 2021, let's look at what a normal year, in a normal year, and we had many, many normal years for which we had ASER data prior to COVID, what was a normal year in a Karnataka or a Chhattisgarh or a West Bengal like? And then look at this the change between 18 and 21 to say, what did that look like? And this is what I mean, is that when you have, in up to 14, we had annual data. And from 14 to 18, we had at least 3 measurements. It really enabled you to see that over a long period of time, where did this COVID come in? And of course, there was a dip. But can that dip, as Wilima said, be compared with what level from what before? And if the dip is compared to where, let us say, learning levels were in 2012 or 2010, then how long did the system, if it just did its business as usual, take to come to some, slightly higher level? But if we take, for example, the case of Karnataka, we can see that, and Karnataka is an interesting case. And the reason I bring it up is because we have this measurement of 2018, school year of 2020. And Karnataka government, and now I'm putting on my Pratham hat as opposed to the ASER hat, Karnataka government, as soon as schools were possible to open in 2021, actually almost 2022, I would say, January of earlier this year, the whole of 2021, they were getting ready for whenever schools open, what can we do for learning recovery? And for their grades 4 and 5, they have in the past also used a method that Pratham has evolved called teaching at the right level. So they were able to get into schools beginning of 2022 and work on these basic levels for grades 4 and 5. And we had a good idea where grades 4 and 5 were in, let's say, February, March of 2021. But what we saw is that in a normal pre-COVID year, the percentage gain that any cohort makes moving from, say, 2nd grade to 3rd grade or 3rd grade to 4th grade is anywhere, depending on the state and the grade, maybe like 15 percentage points in a normal non-COVID year. But when you come in post-COVID or when once schools open with a very focused plan to say, I'm going to rebuild my children's basic skills, which Karnataka did, in the period between January and March of this year, they were able to bump up their learning gains, the ability of children to read, let's say, a simple story at the 2nd grade level, 25 percentage points. And this is data coming from the whole state, using the very similar tools to ASER, which means that, yes, the situation was not good before, the situation became worse now. But if you recognize and see the situation for what it is and act accordingly, keeping aside your new normal business, normal curriculum, you may actually be able to rebuild better than where you were pre-COVID. So, the examples here that I'm giving is partly to say we have data. We have data that, obviously we will praise our own ASER, but even if I wasn't a core ASER person, I would say we have data that everybody can understand. Can your child read a simple paragraph? Can your child read a story? And you remember that all families, educated or otherwise, were engaged in helping their children. So even families like that can understand this kind of an indicator or data. And imagine if a state government moving quickly can show a big jump. Then if an appeal is made to all families to say, just read with your children every night, you can make a big gain. You can compare it to the trend in your state or your district from the past. And so that line, which had been flat or slightly going down before COVID, went down further during the school closure years, can be bumped up because we realize that some action is needed. My own feeling is that the new education policy, with its focus on building foundational skills, particularly in the early grades, is playing a big role in this. Change what you're doing, move into this basics. And I think the ASER data will, can help looking at what you've done in the past and position you quite neatly for what you need to do for the next couple of years. So I want to move our conversation to the point at which we are right now, to a September 2022. By the grace of whoever looks after us from up there, the survey is in the field. It'll be the first major ASER countrywide since between 18 and 22. The world has turned upside down and probably the right side up again. And so, Wilima, on the eve of this ASER 2022 spreading all over India, what's in your mind? What are you thinking? Go on.
No, it's really very, very exciting. I mean, we've been waiting to do this for 4 years. The last big ASER was in 2018. Even though we've done like 5 ASERs since the pandemic started, it hasn't been our main ASER across every district of the country, and it's in the field. In fact, Rukmini, 2/3 of it will be done by the end of September, because there's so many holidays in October. So really excited to see the results. Lots of things in terms of now schools had started to open, then they shut down, especially for younger kids, and I would say now they've been open for about 6 months, okay, across the country. So, and our last measurement, even in those 3 states, was in December of last year. So, we've had, like you said, we've had an opportunity to kind of shake up things. And I think this ASER will tell us what has really happened. Have we made up any of the ground that we lost we have estimates for 3 states, like we just talked about. Other states, we can assume it was pretty similar situation. So where are we on that? Situation in enrollment has been fairly fluid. Hopefully, we will see where these numbers, do we see a continued rise in government school enrollment, or has that stabilized? And private school, we see an increase in private school enrollment. What about children currently not enrolled? We saw, like I said, it was mostly among younger kids. Now there has been time for kids to get re-enrolled in school. So I think this ASER is very exciting for a variety of reasons, because there's been all this uncertainty where we haven't really had information. We've become so used to having ASER there first every year, then every other year, that having a fairly good idea of what is happening on the ground. And now there has been this long period where we don't know, and so there will be things will get clearer. So it's very exciting from that point of view. and just in terms of, I think the everybody has been so cooped up. I think this ASER, if you talk to the ASER volunteers and the ASER teams, everybody is out, right? And it seems like that we're back to almost normal. The office, as you know, is completely empty. Everybody's out in the field, and it's very nice to see all these photos coming back from this field, of our people out there, children back in school. So very excited to see the results.
But two questions, or one question, that one of the things that has happened over this period of, say, the last 10 years, or even if I look at the last couple of years, is there has been an acceleration of measurement of learning in lots of other ways. Even during the school closure period, there were other studies that were done that tried to measure learning. Of course, there were sampling questions about if you didn't have a prior sample, then how do you go back, and so on and so forth. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about other measures of learning that happened during the lockdown, during the period that schools were closed. And also the government did a national achievement survey in November of 2021, and actually the first early grades assessment, which was the National Achievement Survey, still continues to be a pen and paper test. But the assessment that was done by NCERT in, I believe, February, March, in that period, was an oral assessment. So, what are your thoughts about all these different measurements that are, coming into this space, and seems to have accelerated a bit in this period when schools have been closed?
Yeah, actually, there were a large number of surveys that were done by various organizations when the schools were closed, and like us, mostly they were focused on access to learning materials, where ASER had a slight bit of an edge, is that most of these surveys, because we don't have phone numbers for the entire country. So most of the surveys that we saw were done by organizations, were administered on, like us, on the phone numbers that they had, and typically they tended to be participants in their program. So Magic Bus had this thing, Oxfam had a survey, but what all these surveys basically confirmed was what I had said earlier, was that the access to digital materials was fairly limited. Kids had difficulties in accessing them and kind of dealing with them. In terms of learning assessments, Rukmini, there were not that many learning assessments that was done. There was one field study that was done by Azim Premji Foundation, again done in the field with the teachers that they work in their own programs, and they also saw large drops in learning levels, like we did in the three state surveys. So during given the format that the surveys took, it was pretty much focused on access. Now, like you said, towards the end, we've had two large measurements by the government. One was the NAS and one was the FLN survey. Now, it's not really, and we've talked about it ourselves, it's not really fair to compare NAS and ASER, because they're completely different. NAS tends to be a more traditional learning assessment, in terms of it is school-based, it is pen and paper, it is, the assessment itself is based on grade level competency, different subjects, children being tested on different levels depending on their grade. And so it's a completely different assessment. But having said that, it tells the same story. So, I can't take one number from ASER and compare it with a number in NAS, like you would say for enrollment. Like enrollment, we all understand what enrollment is. I can take enrollment numbers from ASER and compare them with DICE numbers, for instance, because you're trying to measure the same thing. But it is difficult to compare NAS and ASER because the assessment is different, the way it is administered, the target population, all of that is different. But having said that, they are also showing learning losses and the same thing. So, and finally, talking about the FLN assessment, which was actually very, very welcome, because as you know, Rukmini, you and I both have been proposing this. It's been like banging our heads against a brick wall, that how do you give a child who is in grade 2 and unable to read a pen and paper test, right? And so finally, we've seen an oral one-on-one assessment done by the government. I have not looked at it very carefully, but whatever I've seen, they've got these state level report cards, and even there, see, they don't have a trend. So it's difficult when you don't have a trend. I can't say, oh, there has been a learning loss of, say, 1 year, which is what we are finding, a little bit over than a year. Because if I have a trend, then I know what the trajectory is year on year. So I can say, oh, business as usual. We see an improvement of, say, 12 to 15 percentage points. What we are seeing that every year, what we are seeing that is half of that this year. So they cannot, so the FLN survey you can't use that to say what has been the learning loss, but what you're seeing is that there are large numbers of young children who are not proficient, who are unable to read and do basic arithmetic that is expected at those earlier grades.
Actually, as you were saying, I was thinking that while we have our basic ASER, and for some reason, I was thinking NAS is like a Kanjivaram sari, which you bring out for certain occasions. It's elaborate. It's it's heavier, and NAS has been done in the past, periodically. Maybe the periodicity will change as we go forward. ASER may be a cotton sari that you wear every day, so it's available, it's lighter, but it's something that everybody can understand. And I think for a country as diverse and as huge as India, more the merrier. And if all of these are pointing in the same direction, then that regardless of whether you're wearing a Kanjivaram or you're wearing a cotton sari, something needs to be done. I also think that we should remember that in the gap years that we've had in ASER, between 16 and 18, in 17, we did a much smaller exploratory ASER on the age group 14 to 18. And some of the tasks or items that we used, that we learned were very useful in ASER 2017, we were able to use for the whole country in 18, particularly in terms of 14 to 18-year-olds, what kind of everyday calculations can they do, right? Do they have awareness about cell phones, things like that. So this year, we are, of course, doing our standard, basic, Khadi, ASER. Anyway, but I'm saying that this year we were committed to doing, the basic one. But it is possible in the years to come. We have two age groups that we worked on before. One is a 4 to 8 and one is a 14 to 18. That 4 to 8 age group that we focused on in 2019 was also very interesting. We had a sense that the new education policy is coming. And in the new education policy, there is going to be a greater focus on, like looking seriously at not just first standard onwards, but to the Anganwadi or whatever, the preschool age kids. And so in some sense, if in subsequent years, we were to go back and look at these two age groups and use tools and methods similar to what we've done before, we could also look at what was happening in more depth in each of these age groups. The first, the young age group, as we all know, the kids who are in first or even in second today have never had any exposure to any preschool or school. So in that sense, they're a very, very different cohort from any cohort of that age group that came before. And it could be argued that depending on where you were, you probably didn't have a very typical childhood either in terms of mingling with children, running around and so on and so forth. And similarly, in the 14 to 18 age group, you probably are today in 10th standard, but the last time you were in school was sometime in 8th, and you haven't had this build up towards your board exams. There's all sorts of things that have been done with board exams in the last 2 years, in terms of what do you ask, how do you do it, and so on. So I do think that, we are constantly, the ASER team, the Pratham teams thinking about where should ASER go in the future. But while we think big and blue sky thoughts, we certainly have these two age groups on which we've worked. In the 4 to 8, it wasn't only literacy and numeracy foundation or otherwise. There was a whole kind of a breadth of skills, starting from a variety of cognitive activities, socio-emotional and so on, that have been tried on a certain, certainly on a large scale. And our new education policy, the direction that it is showing, one is a continuum across these this age group, so that you think of a foundational end stage, but where we should reach, which is what the Nipun Bharat goals are. But I think it points also to the fact that this foundation that we have to build has to be broad and deep. And therefore, what is the appropriate measurement that helps in helping us all think about this? And the 2019 ASER was very useful in that sense, because you could see how strong cognitive capability was highly correlated to numeracy, how a variety of language skills were connected quite positively and directly to reading and so on. The 14 to 18 age group has always been one of the ones that is sort of a black box. There hasn't been, other than India occasionally saying we should do PISA, I don't think and everybody should pass the board exams and do very well. I don't think we focused really on what we want children in that age group to be doing. So in some sense, Wilima, I feel like, we've been doing this for years, but I think our work for the next couple of years is quite cut out. While we need to do new things and learn new methods, think about new directions, but even building off of one more layer of the 4 to 8 and one more layer of the 14 to 18, I think is urgently required for India.
Yes.
If Ashok was in this conversation with us, Wilima, what would he have said at this point? And he had a very wonderful way of provoking while being really sweet. I think it's a skill that very few people have. What do you think?
I don't know what he would have said provoking, but he would have certainly said one thing, So I'm also going to, Rukmini, publicly announce the release of ASER 2022, which is January 18th.
Okay.
The date has been fixed, and he would have said, I want to come back to you after that and then ask you whether what you thought at that time, is that something that we actually see? Because he would have asked us to predict and then come back to us to see whether that prediction has come true. What do you think?
So I think he would be smiling when we said that we have to do our normal ASER and we have 2 other things that we've done before we want to continue. And he would have had that very Ashok-like grin and said, guys, but how long are you going to keep doing this? What are you going to do next? And I think that is something that we all need to think about, because the further forward we go, the more important the whole trend from 2005 onwards looks like. We have, at least for India, a Nipun Bharat goal, whether we are looking at a timeline of 2025 or 2027, it's in the next couple of years. There is an SDG goal for the world at large, which is 2030. And I certainly think that this trend that we have, this whole approach that we have, I mean, I don't know how to say this humbly, because I feel that we may have been a little ahead of our time in starting this measurement of reading and math in 2005. But today, many years later, this is what everybody is concerned about. And I do think that we need to carry this thread up to a logical point. And in this next couple of years, as resources, interest, priorities, not only in India but across the world, focus in on this. How do we build the first foundation well, while not forgetting those who have passed that age but still don't have their foundation in place? I personally feel that there is a big role still for this very simple assessment that needs to continue.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because, I remember when we first started doing this and people saw our tool, it was 2005, and they said, "Oh, come on, everybody can read this, right? You're not planning this, okay? You're not thinking right. You'll get 100% kids can read this." And at that point we said, yes, maybe, in which case that'll be a baseline and that'll be great. And then maybe we will do another one with a higher level tool. But here we are sitting in 2021 and kids are still struggling with the same thing. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree that, this is a very, and I think I said that in one of the pieces that I wrote for I4I, that this whole issue of learning levels, the education landscape, it's like a very large elephant, right? We are working on one part of it, but there's plenty of space for other players doing different things. So like when we were talking about mass and so on. So I absolutely agree that, there is still, and we are committed in this cycle for doing, 5 big ASERs, so that'll take us till 2026. So
I've been across the country. We have about 1,200 master trainers for ASER, who are the ones who lead the ASER survey in the district. In each district, it's a local group, a local organization, local institution, often teacher training colleges, NGOs, universities, who are the actual surveyors for ASER. And as we have been speaking and visiting these state level trainings, I'm so impressed that there are, in every group of state level master trainers, there are people who 8 years ago, 10 years ago were surveyors. Exactly. And who have come back. I was just in UP, and they've just completed their state level training. And there were 2 gentlemen who have been doing ASER first as surveyors and later on as master trainers since 2006. And I asked them, what do you do otherwise? And one of them said, "मैं तो खेती बाड़ी करता हूँ, वही मेरा काम है. But ASER के season में मुझे यूपी का चेहरा देखने का मौका मिलता है, तो मैं 2 महीने के लिए खेती बाड़ी छोड़ के ASER में आ जाता हूँ." And to me, at some level, this is what this whole ASER is about. It is about the data. It is about trends over time. It is about rigor. It is about systematically but simply doing what India needs. But it's also about lots and lots of people every year, 30, 40,000 volunteers who get a first-hand feel of where our children are at and hopefully feel part of the responsibility of changing what is on the ground. And to me, this is one of the most enduring values of us, is that we as citizens of India are as responsible for what happens to the next generation as anybody who is in an institutional structure like a school or a social arrangement like a family.
Yeah.
We should probably start concluding. I'll say one last thought that I've been having for the last 1 hour, and then I'll pass it on to you, Wilima. I think, without making artificial comparisons, I think ASER has done to the world of technical assessment and measurement, this bringing in of an ordinary person who can play a major role. I think in many ways, and Wilima has strong academic credentials, I don't, but I feel I4I, under the guidance and love and care of Ashok Kotwal and his team, has brought these kinds of serious discussions on important policy matters available to ordinary people. And one of the things I love most about I4I is now that you have a Hindi version of many of the things that you do. Because if more people are not engaged in these discussions, if more people are not engaged and participating in these actions we are talking about, then, I mean, this is needed for an India to change. So that's my parting shot, Wilima.
You wonderfully said, and thank you. Thank you to I4I, and we hope to do this again very soon.
And come on the 18th of January
yes.
to India International Center for the launch of ASER 2022.